A U.S. government watchdog report released this week reveals exactly how the Afghan military lost power after America's botched exit from the war-torn country. Now, the Washington Post previously reported the Taliban brokered surrender deals, but there's more to the story than that, according to new reporting from the Washington Post. So then President Ashraf Ghani, who purportedly fled in a helicopter full of cash, he feared, it seems, that he would be overthrown by the U.S. and by his own military, the report reveals. Ghani's dismissal of senior security officials and key commanders on the ground reportedly confused the war effort and culminated in the country's fall, according to the report. Research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Adam Weinstein, joins us to discuss the findings further. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So what are we to make of this? There's obviously some validity to this reporting that he was concerned that this was going to happen, but is there reason for him to think that was a realistic concern?
Well, I think Washington suffered, and Kabul as well, suffered from an inability to speak frankly about just how bad things were on the ground. And so we were just incapable of grappling with this reality. So we engaged in a kind of unhinged optimism, is what I would call it. But it also, remind viewers that if you read through the entire SIGAR report, they don't say that if we just stayed 2 more years or 3 more years, everything would be okay. It was going to be measured in decades and hundreds of billions of dollars if you really read through that report. For example, the Afghan Air Force wasn't projected to be capable of maintaining their own aircraft until 2030. That's just one metric. And historically, those metrics have often been pushed back.
See, Adam, this is what's so confusing, I think, for so many people, that there was this gulf, right, between how the public perceived the withdrawal. They were eagerly anticipating, were happy that Biden actually followed through on this, if only this, of his campaign promises, and how the media covered it, which was that it was a mess, which is not necessarily untrue, but it seemed to be part of a project of saying, beating the drums of war and wanting us to stay in Afghanistan. How should we perceive this reporting from the Washington Post as part of that ongoing narrative?
Well, look, if you read the first line of the SIGAR report, it basically says that the U.S. Taliban agreement and the withdrawal was the major factor in the ANDSF collapsing. And that's technically true. The same way if you removed life support from a terminally ill patient, removing the life support is what killed them. But if you read deeper into the report and you go through the rest of the interim report, it does talk about the terminal illness of this institution, the ANDSF, which was fraught with corruption, which the United States was trying to make in its own image instead of creating a more sustainable model for Afghanistan. And so what essentially happened is that I think Washington became sort of hooked on its own narrative, whereas if you went and talked to the American people, I think the average American realizes that it just is basic common sense that if you can't build a sustainable government abroad in 20 years, then you might not be able to do it in 40 years either.
Does the report recommend that there should have been a differently organized withdrawal, that different steps should have been taken, like trying to get our people out further in advance, which I understand is something Ashraf Ghani didn't want because he didn't want to make it seem like his government was about to collapse, even though it was. But things of that nature, were they recommended in the report?
The report didn't really go into the counterfactuals of what could have been in terms of a different type of withdrawal. Although, as a veteran of Afghanistan myself, I'd say it's unacceptable that we didn't get the special immigrant visa applicants out, the former interpreters out ahead of time. But that goes back to the crux of the problem, which was an inability in Washington or Kabul to grapple with the reality of the ground situation. Planning far enough ahead to get the interpreters out would have required an honest conversation in Washington about just how much of a military advantage the Taliban has and just what a paper tiger the Afghan government and the ANDSF were. But we weren't ready to have that conversation. And the cost is that tens of thousands of our partners are now trapped. Many of them are being executed. So that's the cost of that.
Yeah. Adam, when you say we weren't ready to have that conversation, what does that mean?
What I mean is that in the lead up to the withdrawal, when the policy debate was happening, there were really two positions. There was a disingenuous position that said, "Oh, we can stay just a couple more years and everything will be okay." And there was the position that, "Oh, well, if we leave and withdraw, everything will be okay." And I think what the conversation we needed to be having at the time was, look, we have two choices. We can stay indefinitely for decades and spend hundreds of billions of dollars, or we can withdraw, and we have to recognize there's an incredibly high probability that the Taliban could take over the country, and so we need to take steps to protect those who supported us. But that became a taboo to say in Washington.
But why is that? And among who was it a taboo? Yeah.
I think it was a taboo in Congress. I think it was a taboo among think tankers and analysts. I think it was a taboo in the Pentagon across the board. It was a taboo because it was an admission of failure. Mm-hmm. And you saw, not until we saw the kind of imagery we saw at the airport in Kabul, did it really occur to people just how bad things were.
Yeah. And to give Joe Biden a little bit of credit, which is not something we do on the show an awful lot, I thought when he came out and said we are doing this withdrawal, it was not, I don't think he painted it like an overly rosy picture that everything was going to be fine when we're getting out of here. I don't recall him doing that. I don't think he either said that the country's going to fall immediately, the Taliban will take over, but he did say that, that look, we could do this forever and it's up to them now and we're getting out. So Biden in that moment had a much more honest reckoning with the American people, and one reflecting actual sentiment among American people that we should not keep doing this forever, right?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think his message resonated with Americans, and so did President Trump's decision to negotiate and withdraw to begin with. What resonates with Americans and the rest of the country doesn't always resonate inside the Beltway with policymakers. My main criticism of President Trump would be, I think the US-Taliban agreement could have been negotiated a little better, and my main criticism of President Biden is that we should have gotten the interpreters out earlier. But at the end, I agree fundamentally with both their conclusions, which was that it was not in the U.S. interest to continue this war indefinitely. I mean, when you hear about some of the alternatives that people suggest, that we should have just remained occupying Afghanistan, propping up its government for decades to come. I mean, are we a colonial power? I don't think so. I don't think that resonates with the American people. And so I think Americans saw a certain common sense in the idea that if a government couldn't sustain itself after 20 years of investment, that we should leave, even if it did lead to horrible things. And I think it's possible to empathize with Afghans who have lost an incredible amount, but also recognize that it was the right decision to leave. Ultimately, I think the people who were responsible for a lot of the chaos we've seen over the last 20 years were the decision makers in the Pentagon and the last several administrations that handled this war. And the people who made promises to the Afghan people that they had no business making because there was no way we could possibly keep them.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.